Okay, we're ready to get started with our next panel. We're very fortunate to have as a moderator for this panel, Emily Hanford. Most of you are probably familiar with her. She is, her work is often on public radio. She is with American RadioWorks. She is an award-winning journalist, multiple awards from different organizations. She worked in the past, she worked at WBEZ. She was an assistant to Ira Glass, and she, of This American Life fame. She got her start in public radio back in the 1990s at WFCR in Amherst, Massachusetts. I think you're an Amherst grad, right? Mm-hmm. In addition to reporting on education, Emily has covered religion, healthcare, labor and employment issues, and politics. And as I mentioned, she's won numerous awards, including from EWA. We've had her as a speaker a number of times, and we're really glad to have her. Emily,
thank you. Great, thanks. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. So we have a great panel of educators here today to talk to us about Common Core in practice. And of course, you know, every education reform has to go through schools and specifically teachers. That's basically the passageway through which all education reform must pass. And I don't think we actually talk about that enough or engage with what's really going on the ground. So we get a chance today to hear a little bit about what's going on the ground. So we have Linda Hanson, who actually works in a school as a K-5 literacy coordinator in Arlington, Massachusetts, and she also is the president of her local teachers union. So she has a couple of perspectives to share on Common Core that way. We have Brian Pick, who takes us more to the district level. He's the chief of teaching and learning for the DC public schools, so we'll hear a bit about how things are going in DC. We have John Wray, did I say that right? Mm-hmm. From Howard County, which is here in just outside DC in Maryland, a suburban county of Maryland. And he'll give us a district-wide perspective too, and he's done some work with Common Core on a national level. But we are going to start with Bill Schmidt, who is from Michigan State, who is going to give us some information about research that he's been doing about the implementation of Common Core. So we're going to get some results today, yeah, of what you've been learning. Great. So he's going to start, and then everyone's going to respond, and then we'll open it up to questions from the group.
Okay. Well, as she said, I want to share with you some research that we've been doing over the last 5 years around the implementation of the Common Core. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a quick moment to remind us all of why this is an important conversation. Sometimes that gets lost as we seemingly have gotten into the middle of this implementation. And I'm reminded just to recall for you about a year ago exactly, the 2012 PISA results came out. Now, I know you know this part, and that's not the important part I want to mention, but we came out somewhere about among the 34 wealthiest nations, we were about 25 or 26. So we constantly are being reminded that in mathematics, our children don't do particularly well. And hence, one of the motivating factors for having a set of Common Core standards. But I want to just make a point from that study that I think is missed in the release of those results. And that is that for the first time actually looked at factors in the school that might impact this literacy test. Now, this literacy test is really important because the Common Core and other college career-ready standards emphasize the college and the career-ready. And if you start talking about career-ready, you're not talking about the kind of mathematics somebody that's going on into the field of mathematics would need. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether the Common Core, being fairly rigorous by international standards, really is what we need in order to get college career readiness. And I would suggest that that study actually has some insight into that. The strongest predictor across all the countries we studied, the 60-some countries, was that the actual schooling in formal mathematics, that is how much mathematics they had of the ilk that's defined by the Common Core, the better the students in that country did. And that was true, as I said, across all countries. That relationship was even among the strongest in the United States. They also measured something called applied mathematics opportunity, how much opportunity kids had to work with applied problems. There's a push often in this country that that's the way mathematics should be taught, especially for issues of literacy. Well, it turns out that's true, but it's up to a point. Beyond that point, not well defined by the study, because the data were not there to do that, but beyond that point, it's actually detrimental and harmful and begins to have a negative impact. So we know now from that literacy PISA-type test that really speaks to the career-ready part and probably to the college-ready, that for those that don't want to be math majors or go in any engineering or scientific field, that this is important. And K-12 schooling does demand rigorous standards. It's not that that's not necessary when you define literacy. It's the opposite is the case. And I just want to tease you with this one. It's a study we'll release very shortly. Schooling around the world is viewed often as the great equalizer, the ability for the means by which children of various demographic backgrounds can rise above where they sit and achieve and move in their society. That certainly is true. It's part of the American dream in the United States. So schools are viewed that way. Worldwide, what we have just found out is they actually aren't. They actually work the opposite. They increase the inability for those children to move on because the relationship of social class to opportunity, in other words, what social class you come from gives a strong relationship to what you study in school. And that then exacerbates the inequalities that those kids come to school with, and that's true in the United States. What about the Common Core, its implementation? I want to talk about 4 challenges before us in terms of the Common Core. The first one is the teacher's background. Now, you all know that. It's nothing to say that's new about that, but I want to take a different tact. We are still, just a few years ago, as a part of a big study, preparing teachers that are ill-prepared to teach the Common Core. It's one thing to recognize the teachers that are already there who did what they were supposed to do and now don't have the background necessary to teach it. But we continue to teach and prepare teachers who have that lacking background. We did an international study, identified the top achieving programs in the world, looked at what all their students were taking, found 9 courses in middle school mathematics that all those future teachers were taking. We used that standard and applied it to the national sample in the US. And we found only about 1/3 of our teachers had that background. And those teachers in those other countries were from countries whose kids perform extremely much better than our students. So we continue to prepare teachers that don't have the background that is necessary. And the scary part is most of those teachers, the bottom 25% of our population of future teachers, they only reach at about 10%. And guess where they go to teach? In our urban centers and our rural areas, not in the suburbs, which need them the least. Now, second category. There is an enormous variation. We've studied 1,500 kids, and we've actually seen how much time they allocate to various topics. And what we find is that there's enormous variation across teachers as to how much time they allocate to various topics. There are no definitions to help teachers understand how much time they should spend with various topics. And so it's a free-for-all. And you have this enormous variation across those teachers. And even more strikingly, when you look at the average across those teachers, like all the 3rd grade teachers we studied, and you ask experts how much time should be spent, for example, in fractions, one of the most central difficult topics for children in 3rd grade and in 4th grade, the teachers on average spend about half the time that the experts say should be allocated to the coverage of that topic. You wonder then whether that may well have something to do with how poorly our children do and how much difficulty they have with respect to fractions. So there is a need for better definition that helps teachers learn how to allocate those 160 days. That's usually the instructional part, eliminating the other parts that go with everything else in schooling. There's about most people figure about 160 school days. How to allocate those across the very challenging Common Core is a real issue that there's little guidance for teachers on. And as a result, there's a lot of, I say, overemphasizing certain things and underemphasizing other things. And from our look at the data, unfortunately, the underemphasize is in the areas where it's most needed because it's the ones that are most difficult for most children. The third thing has to do with, even when teachers teach like fractions, one of the most difficult aspects of the Common Core is it calls for a wholly different way of thinking about it. It's like this kind of mathematics is not about a series of isolated topics. It's trying to recognize the fact that all the mathematics that's taught, within a grade, across grades, is all part of a larger story. And if children understood that deeper story, they would have a better sense at understanding mathematics. And that's not the way it's taught typically in the United States. We have 140 videos we took of teachers looking at these issues around the Common Core. And they get to a certain point in their instruction, covering a good topic that they should be, but they don't know how to close it because they don't know how to connect it to a deeper, bigger idea, which then gives the kids a chance to learn beyond just trying to memorize all these things. Simplest example, fractions should be introduced to kids on the number line. If it's introduced any other way as parts of a whole, kids get confused. They have no idea how that's connected to the rest of the numbers they've just been talking about. That kind of thing seems so simple, is so central to the new zeitgeist undergirding the Common Core standards. And lastly, has to do with something I've written about. There was a nice article in Ed Week about this, and that is the instructional materials that are available to our teachers. Those instructional materials essentially do not, in its simplest, shortest form, line up particularly well with the Common Core standards. Think about this. We have given our teachers the task of teaching something that's challenging, that they have not had the proper background provided to them from the schools and colleges of teachers' education. They are being asked to then use books that don't line up with those Common Core standards. That's not a situation any person of any professional sort would want to be put into. Yet that's the situation our teachers are actually being placed into. Those textbooks, you can ask two kinds of questions. What percent of the standards at a given grade level that should be covered at that grade level are actually covered? We've studied 35 series, 700 textbooks. NPR had a nice thing on this that they did from coming to visit us. And what we find is on average, in most of these books, they cover somewhere around 50, 60% of what they should cover. So in other words, they're not even covering all the standards that should be covered. You would expect at least minimally those books would cover all the standards they should. Last, and the second indicator you can use for this is what percent of the book is on track as to covering what. It's a different question. First one is how many of the standards that should be covered are covered. The second one is how much of the book is put to those standards. That's the startling fact. It's anywhere from about 40 to 80% of these books are completely irrelevant to what should be covered at the grade level involved. In other words, those 800-page 8th grade textbooks, most of which, the preponderance of what's in them, is not relevant to what should be taught at the appropriate grade level. Now, there are some new books coming out. There's some optimism that those are going to be better lined. One thing I saw just the other day was one of them is actually shorter than its previous version. So there is some chance that these will come out. But I think that's the situation that is the case for most of the teachers at this present time. And we analyzed the most commonly used books to look at these issues. So those are the four issues that I think are really the biggest challenges for our teachers. And if you look at it, a lot of it has, and I want to make this really clear, I don't blame the teachers. All of those issues revolve around policies that have been set by others and foisted on the teachers. How they're prepared, they don't control. How the time issues has not been addressed. All of these things, the instructional materials, they didn't design them. So much of what the teachers are facing is not of their own ilk, and yet they're the ones that will be held accountable in some sense as these tests are administered. I think it's later this year. So yes. That gives you my sense of what about 5 years of huge data collections tell us about what's going on out there. I do remain, and this is the only way I'd end this, as the eternal optimist I always am. I think it's moving in the right direction, but I think we have to stay tuned to this. And you, the press, I think, have to help the public understand these issues, because what is out there is such erroneous nonsense that's floating around, which is influencing parents who know nothing about the Common Core, but they're against it, if you look at those surveys. So I think you have a role to play in all of this. Thank you.
Can I just ask you one quick question before we move on? So in these, you said 140 videos, is that what you said? Mm-hmm. So is there, what good things are you seeing that are changes in the terms of the way that teachers are teaching math? What's the good news, besides the fact that you're an optimist?
They're really trying. They are trying to do the standards. They're not pushing back. They're actually digging in and trying to do it. And that's encouraging. And you see signs of them getting ever so close to bringing that voila into place where it connects to something else. So I think it's moving in the direction we want it to move in.
So ultimately, the answer then, what's going to get the teachers to that final? They're like not closing these lessons on like, what's going to? Is it about better teacher? What should be done?
Well, two things I think absolutely have. We need the better materials, so they're not fighting that battle. That thing I said about at third grade they teach half as much as the experts say they should. Mm-hmm. Guess what also is half of what the experts say? The amount of space in the textbooks. So that's probably where that's coming from. So that would help immensely. And I think the other one is we have to prepare the teachers. The colleges and schools of education have to face this. They haven't. It's frustrating. I live in one of those kind of universities, and it's a well-regarded one, but they just don't address some of these issues. In the rest of the world, whatever their standards are, the teachers, as they're prepared, are taught those as a part of their instruction. That's a rare event in this country.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Linda, tell us what's happening in Arlington.
So, thank you for having me today. I have my own remarks prepared, but I just want to follow up really quickly on a couple things that Bill said. One thing I heard recently in Massachusetts is that there are 65 teacher preparation programs around. In Finland, they have 4. In Singapore, they have 1. So just to echo your thoughts about the great variety of teacher preparation programs and kind of how they're helping teachers prepare for this brave new world of education is really important and significant. And I also want to say that I'll get to this point in my remarks, but I think the point of providing teachers with the right kind of professional development and curriculum resources is really what I hear teachers in my district and across the state begging for most. So I think our remarks line up really well that way. So I've been a teacher for 23 years. I started out as a classroom teacher in a sheltered English immersion and bilingual Haitian program in an urban setting. I then went on to become a building-based reading specialist, and my current position is as a district literacy coach and ELA curriculum coordinator in my suburban district. It's also my 3rd year as the president of our local teachers association. So my job right now is to upgrade instructional practices and curriculum to help teachers upgrade their instructional practices and curriculum to better meet Common Core demands in literacy at the elementary level in the 7 elementary schools that we have in our district. 2 of them are Title I schools. I would characterize the teachers in my district as actually being pretty excited about the new standards, and they find them motivating for both students and teachers. They're really engaged with the emphasis on persuasive argument and informational writing with evidence. And they also like the emphasis on synthesizing multiple diverse sources to create and analyze a point of view. But teachers are stressed out. They are stressed out by the fast pace of this huge recalibration of instructional expectations, alongside the multiple overlapping initiatives from state and federal levels. Teachers are told that while you are re-engineering the way you teach and what you teach, you should also, by the way, do the following. Completely overhaul your evaluation system, take a graduate level course in the best practices for English language learners, that's something specific to Massachusetts, and meet the new accountability requirements as part of the No Child Left Behind waiver. I think something that's forgotten a lot is that elementary teachers have the heaviest load to bear here. They've had to change their math practice, their reading practice, and their writing practice, as well as upgrade the way they're integrating literacy into their science and social studies lessons. And what this has led to on the part of curriculum developers is kind of a tug of war for time during professional development, release time for those teachers. Everybody wants the elementary teachers because everybody has so much to do to help them really do the work they need to do in each content area. I think the most often heard critique of the Common Core that I hear does not have to do with the Common Core itself. rather for the race to accountability through the newly proposed PARCC assessment system, which is what Massachusetts is aligned with. The prioritization of the new assessment and accountability platform is far outstripping the capacity to support teachers with the implementation of the new standards. State and districts are now gearing up to provide technology necessary for online tests on a scale that did not exist when the focus was providing that same technology for teaching and learning. So we find like teachers see there's something wrong with that picture. And as I said before, teachers I know are begging for more time and resources, for more and better professional development and curriculum to support their efforts. I'm just going to touch briefly on the PARCC assessment before I pass it on to the next speaker, and I know we can come back to it if you have more questions about it. But the new standards have naturally meant revisions to the assessment system. In Massachusetts, we're aligned with PARCC. We have, by the way, already updated our Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System to meet the Common Core standards, but at the same time, the state is looking at the PARCC assessment. And at the end of last year, Mitchell Chester, who's the Massachusetts Commissioner of K-12 Education, said that districts needed to choose for this year between the new upgraded MCAS system or the PARCC, either the pencil and paper version or the online assessment version. And his goal was to get a 50-50 split between districts to facilitate a comparison of the two tests. Superintendents initially assumed that this would be an executive decision on their part, but a subsequent ruling by the lawyer for the Massachusetts Association of School Committees or school boards ruled that it, in fact, was a policy decision. So this opened the door for what turned into one of the best debates that I've participated in my community around the purpose, frequency of, intended and unintended consequences of standardized testing. So I'd be happy to go into more detail about kind of how that went down and what that looked like if people are interested later in the Q&A portion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we're going to move to right here in Washington, D.C. So what's happening in D.C., Brian?
Good morning, everyone. D.C., we're fortunate we have a long history of reform here. However, we are now focused squarely on what I call the instructional core from Dick Elmore. And that is incredibly important. That is the interaction between great people, high quality content, and engaged students. And all the resources for us go towards this instructional core. The instructional core is really the vehicle for change around the Common Core standards. So we've been working on the Common Core now for 4 years. And I'm trying to think, if I were to kind of do this panel, what we'd actually do is pack up our bags and walk about 3 blocks that way to the school without walls, one of the high schools here in DC. And I try to kind of paint a picture of what you might see if you walked in there. And that'll be in 4 buckets of work that we worked on. First is a tremendous amount of work around mindset or expectations. The Common Core really is at its heart, it's raising the expectations for what kids do and what they know. And to do that, we've done a lot of work with changing adults' perceptions of what kids can do. So I'll give you a couple examples of that, which I think, I'm trying to think if I were in your role, what is the sexy part of Common Core? The district, we spent a lot of time on teacher evaluation, on human capital reforms, on school closures. Those are super sexy and interesting. My thing that I love is that instructional core, particularly the content that kids are learning. So for expectations, we've done a lot of work with Carol Dweck's mindset. And we've actually, as a leadership team, all read that. We just finished as a leadership team reading Amanda Ripley's new book, The Smartest Kids in the World. Having conversations explicit about what kids can do when they have high expectations held for them. It is the most important aspect, I believe, of meeting our goals as a district. We've also we've looked at a wonderful piece from Expeditionary Learning called Austin's Butterfly. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it is the power of high expectations for first graders. And it's a video that takes a look at a student's drawing of a butterfly. The first drawing looks like what you would expect a 7-year-old to draw for a butterfly. They do 6 drafts, and by the final draft, it is a mind-blowing change in the outcome of what that butterfly looks like. And it's about the expectations that the teacher has, the feedback and the practice to get to that outcome. We view that as a whole district. We've done close readings of scientific text that's hard for adults to read, to put ourselves in that challenge, that persistence mindset, to have a growth mindset. The second piece of work that we've been doing in DC is a tremendous amount of work around curriculum. And we're a little bit fortunate in DC because, sorry to say it, but we did not have a curriculum prior to the adoption of the Common Core. There was a long history of neglect in the curricular work of the district. You actually had to go back to about 1976, a curriculum that was in place for 15 years and then thrown out in 1989. They were going to revitalize the curriculum, but they never did that work. So in many cases, in many ways, we were better off because it was a green field. We could start building from that and not have to tear other things down. So we worked closely with several of the authors of the Common Core to write the scope and sequence for fourth grade that has lots of fractions. Right, those are what the kids are doing right now, and they'll do it for about half a year. The curriculum work for me is incredibly important, and I think you have to ask the right questions to get the right information from curriculum directors and teachers. What are you reading? How are you building content knowledge and background knowledge through coherent units of study, text sets that build with complexity? Lots of stuff around the complexity of what you're reading. Of course, the balance of informational and fictional text, a big hot topic. There's a lot of stuff in the curriculum aspect. Very fascinating stuff on the English language arts side. I think that there are interesting topics right now around reading comprehension as a whole and measuring of that, much like Park is going to do, versus the strategies and skills approach of standards-based instruction. I think there's an interesting space happening there. The third piece of work we've been working on is professional learning of adults. And I think that there's not enough stories out there around what makes good professional learning happen, following teachers who've experienced that change and trying to tell the story of adults changing their practice that benefits kids. In DC, we have a $12 million investment in school-based instructional coaches. One of the kind of only proven things, you have to learn something, follow up in your classroom after doing it, get feedback, modeling, planning, change. But having some illustrations of we are going through not just kids changing what they experience, but really the adults and learning in the system. We need to be learning organizations. As my boss, Chancellor Henderson, always says, we are a human development, a learning organization. We take little people, we make them better big people. We take big people, we make them better big people. We are a learning organization. And then the final work that we're doing is around formative assessment, making sure that the tools, resources, materials that are provided to teachers help students, parents, their families, and teachers themselves know how kids are progressing. And we have built an entire new suite of online, adaptive, and fixed form formative assessments that reflect the focus areas of the Common Core. They have innovative item types to show not just multiple choice responses, and then working with teachers to use that data. And this gets down to some of the nitty gritty. Like, we moved our professional development days and embedded them into the school year. So there's a unit of study, a formative assessment occurs, and the following Friday we gave off so teachers could do the data work and the planning work to get ready for the next unit. It's like really some of this nitty-gritty work of making the instructional cycle run. There is a tremendous amount of hope with the Common Core in this district. If you were to talk to teachers, I think they enjoy the joyful rigor that they're seeing in a lot of the tasks, in a lot of the text. There is a lot of worry about the Park assessment and what that is going to mean for them, for their students, and for education as a whole. But I would say overall, because we've been now 4 years in, and it's kind of a steady stream of work, people here are generally hopeful around what the Common Core means for them and their kids.
Okay, thank you. All right, John has some things to show us.
So a little bit about where I'm from. I work for the Howard County Public School System as a middle and high school mathematics supervisor during my day job. I'm also one of the board of directors for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. So I'm in my third year doing that, and then I also live at the higher ed level is the current president of the Association of Maryland Math Teacher Educators, which is an affiliate of the Association of Math Teacher Educators. So it's sort of live in the K-12, and my teaching experience is in elementary school. So my world sort of extends from kindergarten, even pre-K, all the way up through college, and then I also happen to be the father of 4 children, 3 of which are sort of Common Core pioneers. So a little bit about Howard County. 76 schools, roughly halfway between Baltimore and DC, 53,000 students. So in Maryland, there's 24 districts, including the city. About 18% Asian, 21% Black or African American, 9% Hispanic, 44% white, 6% 2 or more races, and about 19% are receiving free reduced meal services. That's a little bit about that. What I want to do, though, is I want to use my time kind of like this. I provided out in the front a document called, it's actually an executive summary called Principles to Actions. And I think this is a really important publication for you. Now, the real publication is a 139-page book that you can get for $5 online. It's sold out 3 times since April 2014. Published by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, it describes the conditions and the practices by which teachers and teacher leaders and policymakers in schools and school districts really need to engage with to implement the Common Core successfully. And so that's what the Common Core is not going to have in its list of standards. And that was a missing piece. And that's one thing that I hope that as you do your research and you do your homework and you engage in conversations with people to build your stories, you also sort of beef up a little bit on, why we're not just why we're doing this, some data behind celebrations, things that we've done really well over the last several decades, but also major challenges that still exist out there. And I'm just going to flash that URL for a second, so that if you want to go to that site, there's a tremendous amount of resources available for free, in addition to the e-version of the book. In addition to Bill's challenges that he mentioned, I want to add a few to the table that we're dealing with. One, in schools, we know that in mathematics, there's been a huge focus, maybe too much of a focus on learning procedures. Okay, so procedures, skills, algorithms, formulas, but without any connection to really meaning or understanding, or the applications that require these procedures. So you think about your own math education. I mean, most of us have some sort of horror story, or maybe most of us have a great experience, which was based on maybe our ability to be fast and accurate, okay, with regard to arithmetic, which early on, which then sort of catapulted us into the higher levels of mathematics throughout our schooling. Too many of our students are limited then by lower tracked expectations and a narrow curricula that Bill mentioned of remedial tracks, which few ever emerge. And so I heard a discussion this morning about the Common Core being described as harder. I haven't read that. I have the Common Core over there. I haven't seen the word harder in there ever, but I did hear, I have read fewer standards, but going deeper, going into depth, like the first bullet there, and also more rigor, okay, and even like higher. And so when we also talk about rigor, would have been my buzzword from this morning. We talk about rigor, we don't mean like harder, and we don't mean more. Okay, there's a different definition. Maybe that'll come out in this morning's conversation. We know that this piggybacks onto Bill's conversation. Too many teachers have limited access to instructional materials and really good instructional materials, tools, and technology. And there's a huge weight being placed on assessment, particularly large-scale, state-mandated, high-stakes assessment that really, in the past, I think up to this point, have emphasized skill and fact recall and really fail to give sufficient attention to problem solving and reasoning and sense making. And finally, this gets to Bill's first and second points. There's really a situation, this is the crisis that I see in my own district, and we're trying to address. Too many teachers of math remain professionally isolated. Many at even the secondary or even high school education, for better or worse, go into high school because they want to be professionally isolated. They want to go into their classroom and be left alone to teach. But what we know is that what we know from research is one of the biggest impacts that we can have positively on student achievement is by collaborating together. And so we're looking for professional development opportunities to increase teacher collaboration and capacity, and hoping that that's going to have an impact on student achievement. I hope you ask me questions about that and the models that we've implemented in Howard County. We use sort of a six-step process, starting before 2010 when the standards came out. Because I was also writing a sort of a landmark report with some other colleagues on fractions, and we were communicating with the lead writers of the Common Core and sharing information. I was also bringing information back to my district, and so I was making sure that the teachers that I worked with were actively participating in the process. So even when the feedback period came out in March of 2010, we actually made our math leaders, department heads, sit down and teachers sit down and actually read the drafts of the standards and provide feedback and submit that feedback. So that was kind of the first step. And then we started engaging in building tasks, and tasks were math problems that were worth solving. Many of them are the kind of tasks that you would see on a PARC or Smarter Balanced assessment in the problem-based sections there. And we engaged over the last 3 years more than half of our mathematics teachers at the secondary level in building those tasks. So we talk about developing resources within districts. Those are some things that we chose to do, but we chose to do it by involving as many people, as many of our teacher stakeholders as possible. We even involved students. So we had students taking these things and field testing and providing feedback. We engaged in a lot of student panels like this, where instead of adults being up there, there'd be students up there that'd be advising us on moves that they thought that we should be making and helping improve their education. Professional learning was huge. We flipped that on its head. Instead of looking at it from the view of slices and grade level slices or course level slices, we started offering in-house courses that were built around the progressions of topics. So Bill mentioned fractions. So I taught a course called Number and Operations Fractions for elementary, middle, and high school teachers. And they came, and we learned about fractions and the progression which is born in actually grade 1 geometry and then grows up and formally starts in grade 3 number operation fractions and then extends into grade 5 and then plays out in the number system where kids are also looking at ratio and proportional relationships in middle school, and then the impact that has on algebra and beyond. So we're teaching courses like that with people from all different levels participating in that. And then we had kind of a cohort model in phasing in the Common Core state standards. So that is probably what sets us apart as being extraordinarily unique when we compare ourselves to other districts. So what does that mean? I'll use grade 6 as an example. So imagine back in 2011-12, that school year, us sitting down and thinking about, wow, so if we are going to implement the Common Core with grade 6 students, what would that look like? And what gaps might they arrive with? We knew they were going to arrive with a number of gaps. One of the gaps that I would mention was that they didn't understand fractions the way Bill described it. And so we were doing a tremendous amount of grades 3 and 4 and 5 fractions instruction in grade 6 with them. Over the next couple of years, we did that each year as we tweaked the standards so that in sort of 2 years ago, we were in absolute full implementation in middle school. And then we were getting into algebra, and then also last year geometry, and this year algebra 2, full implementation in high school. So we were very careful about taking that approach. It took a lot of extra work, took a lot of extra money, but we felt like if we were trying to reach here, okay, over the last 5 years, we were going to do it kind of like this instead of, like that for districts that were just going with the cold turkey approach, or the let's phase K1 in the first year and then 2-3 the second year, and 4-5, and sort of following a cohort of kids that might never get exposure to the Common Core.
John, I think we're going to try to work. Can we wrap up in a couple minutes so we can get questions?
So that's kind of the approach that we've taken, and I hope you ask me more questions about that approach. But I did want to just make sure that you guys had access to this resource, because I think that it's going to provide you guys with a wealth of information. Okay.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank
Emily,
you. Yeah.
Can I answer your question? I have
Sure.
a better thought because
Okay.
it deserves better reflection.
Okay, yeah, and I have something to say about that, too.
I truly believe this is the most important thing.
Okay.
It is that we have finally severed the umbilical cord between the textbook and curriculum, so that they don't now think they have to follow the textbook. That alone probably is the single best thing. The only downside is that they're not capable of writing those standards.
Now what do you
we
do?
need those better materials, but even if you have better materials, you don't want to become a slave to them.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned, John, is that we do have, I think, in this country, a culture of teaching that is very much about going in your classroom and closing your door and sort of inventing teaching on your own, and that every sort of brilliant teacher kind of invents it themselves. People can disagree with me, but one of the things I found interesting in the data that Eric was talking about this morning is that the people who oppose Common Core, I think the most frequent reason for opposition, 65% of people say that's going to limit the flexibility of teachers to do what they think is best. And I just think we have a very strong culture that teachers have to be able to decide what they think is best. And I'm not saying that their teachers shouldn't be able to make some decisions, but what we are putting in place here is something that's a lot more similar to other countries, which is saying, there are some things that you are a third grade math teacher, and these are the things that you need to do, and these might be some really good ways to do it. And how do we get that balance between, telling teachers what they need to do, which I don't think works, but having teachers work together to figure out and have them be collaborative about it and to really cut through that kind of culture of independence, which is clearly it's a cultural thing, because people in surveys are saying that's why they don't like Common Core. So like all of us who even are involved in teaching, we think teachers get to invent it on their own. So
nowhere else is that the case.
Yeah, and right. So we're going to open it up for questions. I do have one question for the panel first, which is, so what are the things that you are finding your schools or teachers need to give up because of the standards that you regret? We're talking about how the idea is fewer. So where is the Common Core getting in the way of good education? Maybe I'll ask you first, Linda, because one of the things about Massachusetts is known for having a great education system already and really good standards already, and now you have these new standards. So, you got any answers to that one?
I actually have an answer to what you were talking about before.
Okay, you can evade the question and answer that one.
So I don't feel like teachers in Massachusetts, certainly not in the district that I work with, and I talk to teachers and presidents in districts all across the state. I don't feel like the argument there is about not wanting to have a new course of study handed to them. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think teachers are really good at teaching, at adapting great units of study, at differentiating great units of study. They're not all really great at developing curriculum on their own. And I think our teachers are looking for those really awesome units of study, not individual Common Core lessons, but awesome units of study. And I feel like that was part of this whole push for statewide and now national standards in the first place. Get the best minds together, create the best units of study, cache them in a in a digital warehouse somewhere, and let teachers put together kind of like a puzzle, pick and choose from these fabulous units of study. And I talk about that with, for English language arts particularly. I know for math, they can't just pick and choose necessarily, but let them put together a great course of study that meets the Common Core standards. And then their job is to differentiate. Their job is to make sure they're engaging and motivating students in their classroom. That's what they're really good at. So I feel like there's still this missed opportunity out there in terms of pulling together the best resources and best minds around these things so that 350 districts in Massachusetts aren't all doing, kind of reinventing the wheel themselves. And I don't feel like teachers in Massachusetts feel like they have to give up a whole lot to reach the Common Core standards. And I feel like that's why there is this excitement around kind of these new things that are now being emphasized, like persuasive and argumentation writing. It's like, cool, we haven't done a lot of that before. Kids have opinions, that won't surprise any of you who have kids at home, but kids have opinions, and they love to share them, and they love to write about them and think about them. So I feel like our struggle is more with putting that great curriculum and units of study in teachers' hands, and give them the professional development so they know, they understand it, they have teacher-friendly lesson plans, then get out of their way.
All right, so we're going to go to the audience, unless either of you have anything you're dying to say.
I just think it's really important not to conflate the standards and an instructional design decision that a district, state, or school makes. That you could have the standards of the expectation, there's very little that says whether you use a process-oriented understanding by design, backwards design process as a teacher, or as a school, or as a district. I could train all the teachers here in backwards design. Unwrap, unpack, unwind, whatever unword you want, the standard, put it on blooms, make an assessment for it, design your instruction. We could be all totally like ownership of the curriculum in your class. Or I could adopt Houghton Mifflin's Go Math and say, we're gonna do this program with fidelity. And both of those things fit under the umbrella of the expectations of the standards. Now, I personally feel like there's a better way to do the standards in an urban district than either of those two extremes, and I believe it's in the unit of study play. But I think it's very important, like we're getting down into curriculum design, instructional design decisions, which the standards generally stay out of.
Yeah, the thing, and I want to make sure I understood the question correctly. I think the thing that we've needed to give up, and teachers are slowly coming on board with this, is it's actually a teaching approach. It's actually the instructional approach in mathematics of the kind of I do, we do, you do in mathematics. So we many of us in this room lived through that. I watched my geometry teacher in high school, prove theorems on the chalkboard, and I just frantically copied them down. That was every day for 160 days. In place of, or in favor of, a mathematical teaching approach that looks more like page 3 of that handout that I gave you. So one that emphasizes reasoning and problem solving, the use of like worthwhile mathematical tasks, kids actually struggling productively in learning mathematics. That's a huge cultural paradigm shift in our country, and eliciting and using evidence of student thinking to guide instructional decision making, among others.
Thanks. All right, we got some questions. Go ahead.
I really do have a bunch of questions, so I'll try to keep it to one. If I end up asking 7, forgive me. But I guess for me, the most important thing I would like to know is it's a content question, so how has the Common Core enabled teachers to pursue more controversial topics? We're talking a lot about math, but what about history and English, where a lot of children, if they don't learn to read by grade 3, they're going to have trouble learning all different kinds of subjects. So how is the Common Core empowering teachers to be more creative in their? We're talking a lot about the how, but I'd like to know about the what, like controversial historical topics. Controversy over the beginning of Thanksgiving. Controversy of genetically modified food crops, topics that traditional public schools would probably stay away from. Are teachers empowered to go after these controversial topics, or they, how is it affecting their ability to go after these kind of things?
Okay.
That's why we don't have any standards in those areas, because of the disagreements. They tried to do that and couldn't get anywhere with a set of historical standards. So I'm not quite sure I understand your question. I don't think the standards in math and English, in English you can speak to that. There's probably more room for controversy, but in math it's all the standards do is to say what should be covered at which grade level. It doesn't say how, it doesn't say by what means, it doesn't say the pedagogy style you should employ. I think that's important to keep that distinction, because I think a lot of the confusion around this and the anger about it from parents is they get confused about that issue. They see some pedagogical thing of their kid brings home, they don't understand it, they blame it on the Common Core. Those are instructional things that the standards don't dictate. They basically dictate coverage and what it is kids should be able to do. At least in mathematics, that's the case.
Well, I guess part of the question is the Common Core changing anything around this? Because I think the question of what kids are actually learning and whether they're being allowed to take on controversial topics has a lot to do with the school system they're in, or the particular decisions being made by those schools or those teachers. I don't know. Do you want to talk? So I don't know if Common
has to
Core,
do with
it's an
the-
interesting question whether or not Common Core would have an effect on something like that. I don't know.
I would actually say it does have a big effect on it, because I feel like the emphasis in Common Core has moved away from content and towards process. It's not just about learning a specific content, but learning how to learn. So for instance, in literacy, the three big areas to think about are what's an author saying, how are they saying it, and then evaluating, critiquing the evidence that is used to say that. So I know now in 5th grade history, they're talking about Columbus, hero or villain. And can you back that up? And let's read 3 different sources and look at their evidence base and say, and then you get to take a stand. What's important is not whether you're right or wrong, but can you back up what your, kind of what your thesis is? And I feel like that's been a huge shift. So I think there is a real shift away from specific content and towards helping kids learn how to learn effectively and rigorously.
It is an interesting question. I think if you give kids, if you're as the teacher or as the school district or the school having less sort of control over the content, and instead giving kids a text and asking them to respond in it and find evidence, you're going to find, my experience as a reporter, that kids love to talk about controversial stuff and they have lots of ideas. And so it is an interesting question. Like, I think Common Core could open that up, and I'm sure we're going to hear some debates that happen in more conservative communities about it. And I've gone into some schools in conservative communities and thought, whoa, I wonder if the people know that they're talking about this. It's great that these high school kids are having a debate about X, Y, or Z, but I don't know if everyone in the community would be so psyched about it.
Yeah, I think the Common Core certainly allows for the introduction of controversy or deeper topics. Does not require it, but the districts or schools can do that. And I agree with Linda. I think there's 2 shifts that allow for that. One is the emphasis on informational text in a balance with narrative. So you're reading more about the world around you in our curriculum, for instance. And the second is the demand of evidence and the importance of argument. So the shift away from always having elementary kids do narratives all the time and to actually argue something with evidence from a text. Well, if you're going to argue something, it's a heck of a lot more interesting to argue something that is got 2 sides and is deep and is meaty. So I just left a 6th grade classroom that was doing child labor, and they were reading about factories and looking at each other's tags where their clothes were made and kind of arguing out. They watched a video of 2 young girls who provide for their family, the 2 sides of the issue. We have a unit on the Holocaust where the kids read The Book Thief and then do some informational text reading paired with that. We have some pretty meaty units across ELA, let alone our social studies curriculum. But again, I think it's a local decision still in terms of what the Common Core says. The one kind of fine point on Linda's thing, away from content, more to process, I agree. However, let's not forget that there's also an explicit call for the inclusion of content in the ELA standards. The importance of building kids' background knowledge explicitly over time is directly in there. There's a whole page on how you would lay out the human body, for instance, and making sure that over the course of going to school from preschool here through 12th grade, you are learning about the world and building content knowledge explicitly.
But that's an example of a decision that you've made in DC about what the curriculum is.
Yeah, that's absolutely a decision. What it is the local decision, but there is a mention
There has to be a what.
you have to have a strong what in there. You are reading about stuff, about the world, and there's the page that illustrates how you might approach that if you were to decide one of the strands was going to be the human body, what you would study.
Could I make one distinction? I could never support the sentence that these are not about content, they're about process,
right.
At least in mathematics.
It's all
the authors
content.
of these things have clearly stated that these are about content expectations. It depends on how you define content. In mathematics, there are certain processes, but it's part of the content. It's not pedagogy. It's not a style of how you teach it. It's part of the definition of that body of knowledge. Every discipline has a set of canons by which you inquire, and that's part of the content. Now, the only thing that I might agree with you on is language arts. A lot of it, except for the literature part, if that's a body you're trying to study, is process. It's not like a discipline. Math, geography, history, those are disciplines that have formal canons and bodies of knowledge. But reading is it's a process. It's a cognitive process. So that might be different where there's more room for, you might call process.
And I think what I'm juxtaposing it against is what I would call our Math Standards 2.0 previous to the Common Core, where there was a lot more emphasis on poetry, defining students being able to define what's a stanza, what, literary elements, things like that. And it's a move away from that and more towards learning how to read carefully and closely and critique that.
All right, we have another question. Hold on a second.
While you're doing that, can I just respond from the math? So modeling is not new to mathematics. However, I think that whether this is controversial for parents or families or teachers, I do think that modeling is being emphasized more and more in mathematics, particularly in middle and high school mathematics. I think that statistical models are going to be an incredible resource for us as we look for cures to diseases like Ebola. Maybe that's controversial in public schools. I don't think it is, but addressing issues like poverty and child labor and desertification and water quality, all those things I think are problems worth solving and problems worth bringing into the mathematics classroom.
Okay.
So my question is about parents and school boards. What reactions have you guys had with them? Have you done anything to inform parents what this is all about and school boards what this is all about? So I report in New Orleans, and there's a school system very well off to the north of the city where the superintendent is all into Common Core and the school board hates it, and there's a whole bunch of parents who are opposed to it, some for political reasons, some for what seemed to, concerns about the standards themselves. So yeah, just wondering how you guys have been handling these situations.
What has the situation been?
So we were pretty, I still think it's reactive. Others might think it's proactive. I never think we can be proactive enough. I mean, I just think that we could do a better job with that. But I know, so an example of how we addressed that was last winter, we held 4 regional meetings for parents and families, not just in mathematics and ELA, but in other disciplines that were impacted by the Common Core. They were held in the evenings. We sort of took the district and split it into 4, and we held it at 4 high schools and sort of duplicated the sessions that were there. And one of the things that we did was we provided parents with a sense of what their child was going to be learning in the different courses, different grade levels, ways in which they could understand maybe new content or new standards, or in mathematics, I'm saying in quotes, new concepts, or unfamiliar concepts, and also ways in which they could support their children if they needed, extra help, extra support, or maybe additional enrichment. And we gathered a lot of feedback from them, and from those sessions we built what's called, and you can Google this, in mathematics, the Family Math Support Center. And so we built resources around those 3 topics that I just mentioned that they wanted support with. And in, I don't know, the first 12 weeks, we've had, 70, 80,000 visits. It's already penetrated actually 62 countries. Never intended to do that, but because it was for our community, but a lot of people are using that resource. So that's just scratching the surface in Howard County.
Could I add one quick point?
Sure.
I've spoken with lots of districts, huge numbers across the country, and their school boards and so forth. One thing I do find is that if you just simply give them information, a lot of the stuff that's out there is misunderstanding. And if you just can provide them with real honest pieces of data and so forth, they tend to mollify a lot from the position they might start out with. So I think, the more one has the chance to talk to them, the better off things get. And just quickly on parents, I think when you talk to parents, you as the press, you should ask them one question before you go very much further with them. Ask them what part of the Common Core they've actually looked at. I find that most of the parents that talk about this game have never seen, they don't have any idea what the Common Core, they couldn't tell you one standard at the grade level that their kid is in. The only image they may have is something the teacher brought home as an exercise, which isn't the Common Core.
And I would say in Arlington, for example, it's the way it's rolled out to the school board and the community from the beginning. I think our administration had presentations from the curriculum heads to the school board, and at the building level, principals held meetings for parents to come in and hear more about the Common Core. So I think everybody it was a positive thing from the beginning, and there were educational forums both at the school board level and at the school level for parents. But I think Park is where you get into the controversial issues where I'm from.
Okay, another question.
Hi, excuse me. I have two questions. One has to do with Park, and a lot of teachers that I hear from, particularly teachers who are maybe more on the side of skeptics of the Common Core, what they'll say when I ask them, how's it going? Do you feel like you're fully using it in your classroom? They'll say, well, really, we don't feel like we'll know until we see the test scores. And then all of this planning and stuff that we've done will, it's not that it's going to go out the window, but a lot may change depending on how the scores come back. Where we emphasize may change. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are about how much this testing that we're about to start seeing some results from is going to actually be driving the curriculum perhaps more so than the standards. That's my first question. Second question has to do with report cards. I've seen parents have showed me report cards that their schools have shifted to that are supposed to be more aligned with the Common Core. And they have this crazy long list of different competencies, and it's so complex as to not seem valuable to me. And I'm just curious what you've done in your districts about that and what you think about it.
I mean, that kind of standards-based grading, those kinds of report cards are sort of a little bit separate from, but connected to Common Core, as I understand it. I mean, there were some districts that were trying that kind of thing before the Common Core came along. There's a lot of private schools that do those kinds of crazy things. Those kinds of, I mean, I don't mean to, that was not meant to be pejorative, actually, because I think some of these kinds of report cards are really interesting. But it's not like, oh, my kid has an A. Great.
Let me give you a quick reaction to Park. I'm on the advisory board for Park and Smarter Balance, so I've seen items, tons of items from both of those tests. They are really tough. They will be a challenge for the children. They are going beyond just 6 times 7. They're going to ask something that might use that, but it's embedded in a broader context. So they reflect those standards. They actually, these two organizations have done a pretty good job of making those line up fairly well with the standards. And yes, there's a lot of research that will say that will tend to drive more what happens than the standards, because they're a what's the word I'm looking for? They're a manifestation of what the standards really are saying, because it's saying what can the kid answer this question. So yeah, they will, but they're well lined up, so it shouldn't undo the standards. But again, I think this is where you all, as the press, have a big role to play, because those results come out, they're going to not be good, because they're harder, they're tougher, and the parents have to understand that this is the first step in the right direction. That those results are preliminary because they haven't been implemented that long, and give some space to this, because I fear that this could cause the throwing out of the standards. And I tell you, from all the international work I've done, we are doing the right thing in math, at least. I can't speak for it. We're doing the right thing for our kids. And so therefore, I would hate to see that happen, but that's a real threat.
But Bill, one of the things, though, is that in other countries, tell me if I'm mistaken, they don't do the same kind of annual high-stakes testing that we do. So this is an interesting question. I mean, the stakes attached to the test has a big impact on how much it drives the curriculum. And, what are we going to see in states about what they're actually going to do with those test results? And how is the federal government limiting the kinds of choices they can make about what they're going to do with those test results?
Well, you mentioned the federal government. The biggest problem, the worst thing that ever happened is Arnie Duncan coming. I didn't stop there for a reason.
That one.
I was just breathing. Arnie Duncan's race to the top, that caused more political hoopla than anything. That's 90-some% of the argument is federal takeover and all that. And that was, what's happening now is the uses of this new standards are being messed up with the standards, like evaluating teachers, like the standards for the kids and the testing and all that stuff. All of that is a use of it. That would be the same use of the standards states used to have. And it's been pushed and mushed up with the standards, and that didn't help anybody. That's my opinion.
I think those are great questions. I want to take the first part of your question and just distinguish, though, between an updated state test that is aligned to the Common Core and PARCC. Those are two different things. And in Massachusetts, we have an updated revised state test that reflects all of the Common Core standards. And I think teachers have a degree of comfort with that. We have had that test for 20 years. We know who develops it, how it's vetted. The first 3 years under that test system was back in the 1990s. Standards are one thing. How standards are assessed are usually they're an eye-opener sometimes. It's one take. It's a specific way to judge how somebody is completing those standards. So when it does come out and it gets concrete, teachers are going to start aligning more of their teaching towards that test. In Massachusetts, we had a 4th grade long composition test that was a narrative test. The end result was 4th graders have been focusing on narrative writing for the last 20 years. So I guess I just want to distinguish, though, between revised standards that meet Common Core and PARCC. So PARCC is seen by teachers as something that's coming in from the outside. It's headed by Pearson. People don't trust it right now. They don't have any experience with it, and they don't trust it. Our Commissioner of Education happens to be the chair of the governing board of PARCC, so that's another kind of interesting connection there. Then there's this other platform question. Moving this test online just brings in and introduces a whole other new component that we haven't experienced before. Everyone has different amounts of technology that they're currently using in their classrooms. The technology around doing something with multiple sources, watching a video, reading 2 different text pieces, and then writing a persuasive piece on an online platform. How does the note-taking happen? How do you toggle between the different sources? So those are things we're wondering about. And, you know, the accountability piece that Bill raised, I think, is really important, because if it were just like, hey, here's a new way to assess these standards, like, let's check it out. Let's use it. That would be interesting and exciting. But when the first time you give it, there's an automatic accountability, high-stakes accountability attached to it, that does change it up a little bit. One other aspect I want to introduce is this 6-year timeline that we're all under for the No Child Left Behind waiver that Massachusetts has, and I'm sure a lot of other states have. So this is introducing a whole new assessment system within this 6-year timeline. So it was from 2011 to 2017. So we're under the same constraints that were laid out back in 2011, but now under a higher, more rigorous system, whereas we're trying to have the number of kids that get to proficient and advanced over the 6-year period. Not just everybody, but also those hardest to reach learners, the achievement gap kids. So I think those are all tied into the questions, and I'll leave the progress report for somebody else.
Well, you know, we have about 8 minutes left, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to allow the people up here to give us a sense of the kinds of questions that we should be asking in our reporting, and also, I think, Brian, you're the one who brought this up on the phone, who we should be talking to. So I don't know if we have time for one more question, if there's someone who has one more question in the audience, and then we do that, or is there one more question in the audience? Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, and I guess, you know, you'll deal with this issue. But I wanted to go back briefly to the teaching and preparing teachers issue. Bill said that, you know, the education schools have been impervious basically to change for so long. Could you go into why that is, or what should, you know, what can be happening or should be happening regarding, you know, how teachers are trained for all these new expectations, not just expectations, but how they work with their colleagues and all of those things?
Well, I'm no expert in this area. I did a study in this area, but I would say this: what we learned internationally is that most of the issues around the teachers and their preparation is the same issues as around the kids in the school. We found how important the curriculum was. We came from the early TIM studies, led to the Common Core. Now we have a set of standards that are competitive internationally. They're high level. The same thing I think needs to happen with teacher preparation. There should be a set of, if it's good to have a set of common standards for the kids, it's appropriate to have one for the teachers, and we don't. And so we took a random sample of 80 universities and colleges. They vary all over the place in what they do and the quality thereof. And one of the things we have is a large number of very colleges and universities do particularly poorly, and they are the biggest producers. The bottom 25%, when we tested those teachers, produced over 60% of the future teachers. Think about that for a second. The worst of the lot, there are more of them, more than half of them, of all the future teachers that come out of the the colleges and schools of education. And why are they? I don't have an answer to that. I can tell you what I think. University professors are really people who think they know the right answers to everything, and so therefore they don't change very much. And you can talk to them, and they're not likely to change. You ever been in a college faculty meeting? It's really ridiculous to watch how long they could go on and talk about nothing. And so that, I think, is honestly part of the issue. It's very difficult to change. And the university itself doesn't want to change much of it because they often are, the colleges of education are the cash cows. They produce lots of students at a cheap cost. And that's another issue that comes in. But it's a real necessary issue here.
I would suggest
Emily.
a whole day seminar on teacher
Emily,
preparation.
So a couple things, and one in response to a comment Bill just made. In my short, so I've been in education for 23 years, so it's pretty short actually, and I've never seen a reform where K-12 or pre-K-12 education has actually been sort of ahead of the game compared to their higher ed and university level colleagues. This is one where initially, I'd say around 2010, there were plenty of higher ed people involved in the writing of the Common Core, maybe even overrepresented, arguably. But here's what I will say. In Maryland, we were having discussions as recently as maybe 3 years ago with people that are in charge of teacher prep who were saying things like, maybe we should align our courses to this Common Core thing. I mean, that was like 2 years into the thing. And so you've had K-12 that, because of their sense of urgency, were already implementing the standards, looking around going, are you serious? Like, you're debating that? As if, do your pre-service teachers want jobs in our districts? Because if they're not being prepared around the Common Core, that would be an issue. However, the CBMS form that sort of governs all of the math organizations, including the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, updated a document called the Math Education of Teachers. And the new document is called simply MET 2. And that describes sort of the content that should be part of pre-service math education programs for aspiring elementary, middle, and high school teachers. So I just want to clarify that.
All right, we have 3 minutes left, and so speed round here. Can each of you think of one question that you think reporters should be asking, and who's the person or type of person they should be talking to? Anyone want to go first?
Well, I'm always fascinated by the grain size of the topic and getting small enough to make it real, but not so granular that it's not applicable to other places. So, for instance, it might be asking the question in ELA, has the district seen an increase or a change in the type of text that kids are grappling with every day, the complexity of that text, the depth of it, the worthiness, however you get that defined, and then tracing that grain size of question from kind of national experts in this world to state leaders, district leaders, to the teacher, the school leader, the teacher, and then the student themselves, and kind of getting that storyline down on a particular slice of the change that we are going for. If it's this kind of the research around the importance of fractions to predict later success in algebra, kind of tracing that professional development experience, that curricular experience, and that learning along that continuum.
I would ask, just simply, I would love to see this story. Somebody should do it, and that is to interview and talk to parents and find out exactly what's in their heads. Take a sample of pro and con and see what's going on, because everybody talks about that. Nobody really knows what that means, whether that's two parents that have to be really happen to be very vocal. You see some of these surveys, but the questions are too amorphous in order to really understand. If they're against it, what are they against? And I would love to see somebody really poke into that arena, because in the end, that may decide whether it stays on board or gets thrown over, depending on what happens when these test results come out. So
It would be interesting to have a small group of parents who are all willing to read the standards and then get them together and talk about them.
Yeah.
Anyone else? We've got like 1 minute.
So I would focus on, since that's the hat I really wear, is what kind of professional development do teachers need? So asking teachers and administrators, what kind of professional development do you need to better meet Common Core expectations? And kind of along with that, what are the holes in your curriculum materials and resources that you need? And I really think the next story going forward around professional development, since Common Core really has a lot to do with instructional practices, it's how we're going to get more innovative professional development into our schools. How are we going to get teachers into other teachers' classrooms, watching what kind of teachers with instructional expertise in one particular area have. I think that's what teachers need to envision, a different way of teaching, not just a different what of teaching.
So I've talked with a lot of pre-service and in-service teachers and administrators over the past several months, including a number of professional development workshops I led over the summer. One of the questions I always ask them is I have them do this point of view activity. And I ask them, what do you think the point of view of the teachers, of students, of administrators, of families, and of the media is? And I just want to share this briefly with you. These are some of the trends that come up, and some of these are negative, so bear with me. I'm not bashing you, but you need to know about this. Their perception is that many of your stories are politically driven. They actually address just the extreme views. They perpetuate fear-mongering. They bring up things like phrases like new math, which is actually from the 1960s. So they resurrect that. They bring up the federalization of education and government takeover and misleading information and a tremendous amount of bias. So I would focus
These
on
are
the
teacher perceptions?
Teacher,
Okay.
pre-service, and administrators, yes. So I would focus on maybe building a little bit more of a positive perception with them by asking, looking for, and I know the answer, so ask me out there if you want to, but I want you to dig in this, and I want you to write a story about at what level are teachers most noticing sort of the positive outcomes coming from Common Core teaching practices. Is there a grade level? Is there a level by band, elementary, middle, and high school teachers? Where's it happening? Because it is happening, and you should dig deep into that. And I would also find insiders, find people like Bill, find people like people on this panel that you can build a relationship with, have sometimes off-the-record conversations, and then on-the-record conversations to inform your work. And I know that many of you guys do that on a regular basis. So,
Thank you very, very much, all of you. Your expertise was much appreciated.